Hey guys, Taylor Braun here with String Fairy. In this episode, we're going to make this loopable 80s sci-fi animation in Blender EEVEE. So let's delete the default lamp and camera, and we're going to create a bunch of cubes collecting in the shape of this cube. You'll see what I mean in a second here. So let's add a displacement modifier here, right here. Click new to add a new texture, and let's just add cloud for the type. Let's change the size here. And then let's go back to the modifier tab and change the strength. We don't really see it looking like clouds. We'll add a subdivision surface modifier right here. Move it up to make sure that it's added before the displacement. And choose simple. And that will retain the general shape of the cube here. Right here. Let's just change the strength until it looks really bad. And then let's add a remesher or remesh and change the mode to blocks. Now we get a bunch of blocks collecting together in the shape of a cube here. And we can always change the strength of this displacement to change it to be more cubic or more random. I like it around there. Okay. Now let's go to the render view. And let's add a light to light up this object here. Area light. Let's give it the power of something like 1000 for now. And then let's increase the scale of this light. Give it a disc shape. Then let's change the render settings here. Let's add ambient occlusion. We can see what that does is that it creates a shadow around the crevices of this object. And then let's add bloom, add some glare, add screen space reflections so that it's reflecting itself on itself. And let's turn on soft shadows. And you can see the difference right here. And we can always change the softness of the shadows here as well. Now let's add a constraint to this light. Constraints, damped track, and set the target to the object, which is this cube here. Use the -z axis. And then we can just drag this around holding G, and we reposition it without having to worry about rotating it towards the object. It automatically does that for us, like so. Okay, now let's add a glass cube surrounding or encasing this collection of cubes by adding a mesh cube, scale it up until it encases the object. Give it a bevel, like so. Smooth shade it. And then let's add a glass material. Now, we don't really see the object refracting inside of it, so let's turn on screen space refraction right here, and also in the render tab as well. Perfect. Now let's copy the light here to the other side. Let's make sure that this object is parented to this outside object. So Control P, set parent to object, like so. And now we can move it around without having to worry about the inside object not following, like so. Now let's add a floor plane here. Mesh plane, move it down, scale it up so it fills the scene, like so. Let's go to the front view, move the lights. And let's add a camera here. Control Alt Numpad 0 to get the view, and holding G and middle mouse wheel we can drag the mouse and close in on the object here. Like so. Now let's increase the power of these lights here to something like 3000. Right here and right here. Like so. Now let's create a new material for this inside object. Let's just give it a new material. And for now, let's just give it a black plastic. Render it out. We see that change in effect. Now let's go to the shader editor. Call it wireframe. Then let's give it a wireframe node. Plug this into the color. Now we can see that it has a wireframe on each of these faces here. And we can always change the geometry to change the node. Let's make sure this is not poking out of the sides here. So let's scale it down. Like so. Okay. Let's go to camera view. And then let's give it some varying thickness across the surface. So let's add a noise texture. Let's plug this into the size. Now let's hide this outside object. We can see that the noise texture is way too intense for the size here. So we'll change limits of how thick it can go using a mixed RGB, plugging this into the factor, and using some value nodes to define the limits, the maximum and minimum size of the wireframe. So the minimum will be 0.02 and 0.001. We see now it's within better limits. So let's add a color ramp here, and let's increase the contrast. So in some areas, it's going to receive more thickness. In other areas, it's going to be more thin. Now let's add a texture coordinate to this noise texture. Pressing Ctrl T. With the node wrangler installed, let's use the object coordinate. Let's change the scale, something like 0.2. Now that's much better. And we can always change the Z rotation to change the pattern. Now let's plug this into a mix between this principal BSDF and an emission. Using a mix shader, I'm plugging this into the factor as a mask. Perfect. Let's change the scale here, something like 0.5 instead. That's a little bit better. And now let's pull up the timeline here. And on frame 1, we will animate the rotation at 0. So press I to insert a keyframe on frame 1. Then let's drag this all the way over to frame 251, or the frame after the animation. And let's set it at 360. That way there's no repeating frames. Now we see that it moves around in a loop. But it slows down and it slows down at the beginning and the end of the animation. So what we'll do is go to the graph editor with the mapping node selected. We'll just change the Z rotation, turn off the Y and X. Let's change this curve to have linear interpolation at the beginning and at the end here. Now it loops seamlessly. Okay. Let's collide this back together. And then let's make this light pulse a little bit. So let's increase the strength, something like 3. And press I. Let's go to the graph editor again. And with node selected, let's add a new modifier, noise. Increase the strength. It's pulsing really fast. Let's change the scale. Let's do 15 for the scale. Make sure that the blend type is on add. That way it only goes up above the level of 3. Like so. Okay. Now, what if we want this to change colors throughout the animation? Well, what we can do is add a color ramp and choose some random colors like purple and yellow. Plug this into the color of the mission, and then we can animate this slider here, pressing I to insert a keyframe, and with node selected, adding a noise modifier, increasing the strength and the scale, and to make sure it's not gray in between these two colors, let's add another slider here. Control left click. Let's change the saturation of this color here, like so. Make it red. Like so. And we can always change the wireframe size right here. And right here. Let's unhide the glass object, so Alt-H. Now let's lower the roughness on this glass. Now let's make this glass cube move up and down and rotate it. So let's press I on the keyboard, press I, and select location rotation. Let's delete the axes that we don't want, like X and Y and X and Y. We only want the Z location and Z rotation. So let's add a noise modifier on the Z location. Set it to add, that way it doesn't go below the floor. Change the scale. And to make sure that it's not, to make sure that it's the same at the beginning and the end of the animation, we can restrict the frame range here. Let's start at frame 10 and end at 10 frames before the end of the animation. So frame 240. Let's make it bleed in and out. Now let's select the Z rotation here and add a generator. Lower the value here to something like 0.02. 0.01. 0.025. That way it's matched with the 250 frames. You will have to change this according to how long the animation is. Okay. Now let's add that sun in the backdrop here. So let's add a mesh circle here, move it up, and then in edit mode, let's add a face, and then scale it up, and rotate it on the x-axis, so RX90. And then let's just move it behind the floor here. GY and GZ. Let's subdivide this. And then let's scale it up a little more. Move the camera back a little bit. And then let's add a new material. Let's close the graph editor as well. And let's add a gradient. Control T to add the texture setup. And press Control Shift left click to view that node with the node wrangler installed. Now let's see about rotating this by 90 degrees, moving on the x-axis, and we get that nice gradient effect. Now let's create some lines on the sun here by adding a wave texture, adding a texture setup, Control T, then using the object coordinate and changing the rotation right here, 45. And then let's plug this into a noise texture to get some more random variation in the thickness here. Like so. And then let's plug this into a math node, set the operation to less than, and we create those nice lines that we can always animate on the z-axis, or like so. Or use an object like this empty to move down. Like so. Now let's plug this into an emission here. And colorize this with the color ramp. Give it a pink on the bottom and orange yellow at the top. And also add a slider right here and increase the contrast. Like so. Okay. Let's increase the strength here to something like 5. And then let's get a transparent node here. Mix this with the emission with a mix shader. Plug the math operation into the factor and switch these up, and then use some clipping here. Like so. Let's add some distortion for the sun by adding a mesh plane, scaling it up, and rotating it on the x-axis, so RX90. Let's move it back between the sun and the ground, somewhere around here. Scale it up until it fills the scene, like so. Give it a displacement. And some more geometry. Click New, then click the little icon here to reach the Texture tab, and choose Clouds. Change the size. Something like that's good. And then let's add smooth shading. Change the strength to something like 0.1. And then let's give it a new material, this a glass. Let's call this heat distortion. Render this out, and let's turn on screen space refraction here. Increase the roughness here. And then let's animate the displacement for this heat distortion. So let's add a new empty plane axis, and then let's use that as the texture coordinate. Now let's rotate this on the z-axis, so I location rotation. Let's open the graph editor again, and let's copy the same settings for the z ruler rotation here by copying it from here, then adding that here. Now it's a loop seamlessly. Let's create a black world here. And then let's create a new material for this ground here. And let's just give it a black plastic. And then let's add some thickness to this, like so, and add a subdivision surface to give it some more geometry, like so. Then add a displacement modifier, like so. Click New, then make this look really, really bad, like so, and give it a remesh. And choose blocks. And change the depth. Something like 7. Move this down. So let's give this the same material as this inside object, which is wireframe. Let's just wireframe here. Then let's add a plane of glass above this wireframe floor. So mesh plane, move it up or down, scale it up, like so. give it a new material, and just give it a new glass. And turn on refraction. And change the IOR. Then we can always increase the contrast here, the color management, like so. Let's lower the roughness on this glass. And then let's go into the compositor. Press F12 to render it out. And then let's open this up in the compositor right here. Use nodes. Turn on the backdrop. And let's just collide this back together. And let's press Ctrl Shift left click. We get that backdrop here. Let's add a few nodes like the glare node. Like so. Let's change the threshold, something a little bit higher, like 1.4. That's a little bit better. Let's mix this with the original image, like so, with mix, and plug the image into the image. Control the factor. Now let's add a lens distortion node, like so. Change the dispersion to something like 0.02 or even 0.05. We get that nice rainbow effect around the edges of some objects. Let's change the bloom to a yellow color. Let's change the glass back here in front of the sun to a yellow. Like so. F12 again to render it out. That looks much better. Now let's render out the whole animation. By going into the compositor and plugging a file output into this last node here. And then it will save to your temp folder. And then you can change the directory right here. And that is how you make this 80s sci-fi animation.